Today I had like 3 Zoom calls in a row in bed, and then I realized I kind of felt like Jabba the Hutt, that I was like just holding audience in my bed.
Welcome to another episode of Shaken Not Stirred. I'm Christy Maiselman, the Executive Director of Cultural DC, and today joining me is Tim Nelson from the In-Series Opera. Hi, Tim.
Good, Misty.
How are you doing?
Good, I'm good. I love the title for this, Shaken Not Stirred.
Yeah. So wait, what are you drinking?
I am drinking a Campari and soda.
Oh, look at you, cocktail. I had big plans that this was going to be lots of cocktails, and then
I was
eight weeks in, and it's just easier to open wine sometimes.
I was looking at a beer in the fridge, and I thought, no, this is a cocktail. I have to make a cocktail.
Good for you. I'm glad you stayed true to it. I'm glad. I think what's so interesting is, and I'm not an opera person. I think you've made me more of an opera person. Yet.
We're going to work on you, Christy.
Yeah, but I think that's what's so interesting, because I think you're bringing such a different perspective to it, and you're really kind of changing kind of what people's perceptions of opera is.
Yeah, I think a lot of the fine arts suffer from the disparity between what we are and what people think we are. Right. And that's nowhere more true than opera. I mean, opera, people say, you say the word and it's so far from what we do. It has nothing to do with what we do, but it's still what people have in their head when they say the word, and the industry is responsible for having made that.
Yeah. So what do you hope? I mean, in what you've taken over here, and I think what I love is that we have found ways to partner and collaborate and kind of take our work into the community. And I want to kind of talk to you about like how community plays a role into like what you're doing and how you're thinking about programming.
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of projects that are all very different, but the one, for instance, for this last year that was most important to me, we did a collaboration with Foundry United Methodist Church that was about immigration, and was an immersive theater experience where the audience traveled with the piece throughout the space, but also community members were part of that guide group. So they were invited into the rehearsal process. They were part of creating the piece. They were responsible for guiding. And what ended up happening, we even had some recently arrived immigrants that became the guides. So for the audience to be guided from people who had been on this journey themselves was particularly powerful. And that's the sort of community stuff that's most, that for me is most meaningful. And we try to find a way with each project to somehow connect to community in different ways. So for instance, when we did the tango opera, we had free tango lessons that then people could dance on stage as part of the production. But trying to find ways to help people involved in the making of opera, I think, is the best way to have people invested in the art form.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great too. You've like tapped into things that are, and I think this is where, you know, at Cultural DC, we try to find this like space, right, where we want to give artists this platform to kind of respond to things that are happening now. And I think that's where you've done something really interesting. You've taken this kind of, I won't say opera is an old concept, but again, like you said, people have a certain perception or an idea of what it is. And I think you have found a way to kind of flip that on its head. And I've certainly seen that through our partnerships when I've seen our Popera at the barbershop and some of the other ones where the artists have really done a great job kind of responding to the work and thinking about new ways to kind of approach it.
It's the joy of being small, isn't it? I mean, we get to do that. And opera, you know, it stopped developing around 1850. And what opera is, but also the way it's made is the same as it was in the late 19th century. And that's big and giant industrial complex that makes it. But it doesn't have to be. And if it's only, you know, 3 people in your administration, you can react like that and make art that's connected to the stories that are going on today as they change. I mean, we'll see that this season with how arts organizations respond to what's going on with the crisis and try to make work, hopefully, that, you know, is suturing wounds and not just doing what we were going to do last year, but doing it this year instead.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, you guys announced a really big initiative, a really big approach to your season next year. Why don't you talk about it? I'm like fascinated by this on so many levels because I also know you and I kind of know your level of your technical ability. So I'm fascinated, but I also think, like, first off, this got a mention in Vanity Fair, which, hello. I mean, I was like, oh yeah, we got the New York Times last year. You got Vanity Fair.
I think the New York Times wins, but thank you. I was glad to have Vanity Fair.
I would take Vanity Fair. I take vanity.
Well,
But
maybe
yeah, please tell me kind of about how you think that I'm like dying to know how this is gonna like work.
you. Yeah, so we've announced a fully digital season. And what was behind that for me were a couple of things. Like, in fact, most importantly, I just couldn't live with our company making promises to artists that we knew we couldn't potentially keep. And then I couldn't bear waiting to plan a season and like not planning a season based on what would be possible when, rather than making work that
Well, I
matters.
think that in itself, I mean, this whole situation has been so fluid and like from week to week, from hour to hour, things have changed.
Yeah, and I find it. I'm sure some people can work in that. For me, it was just impossible.
Yeah.
So, and then we started to think, well, if you were virtual, then what you do in terms of accessibility, in terms of working in forms that can retroactively innovate the art form, and our art form needs a lot of innovation, is really inspiring, really encouraging. It does interesting things for the budget. It allows you to focus on do works you would never be able to do otherwise. But like you're alluding to, I'm the least likely person to
I
do
can say
it.
that because I am too. And I have a team behind me that I rely on like no other.
That's what it's going to take. But a lot of it was just having to get over myself. I mean, that
Yeah.
what we gain in accessibility is worth 100 times over what we lose in terms of the magic of live performance, which is great, but there are other things out there. So in July, we're going to be launching an Opera House Without Walls. That'll be a sort of virtual space for content that'll house all our content. So each month we hope to produce 2 significant pieces of content, plus a lot of outreach and education and learning stuff, and also to partner with other organizations that are trying to do a similar thing, so we can be sort of a clearinghouse for that. Everything's going to be free. That's the most important thing. It's going to be totally accessible and free, but then we have a huge learning curve in terms of how do we market to a global audience all of a sudden. And yeah, there's a lot to learn.
I think what's interesting too, it's a huge opportunity to broaden your audience, but also broaden the audience for opera.
Yeah.
I mean, I think when you talk about accessibility, I think certainly there is a certain percentage of your patrons that are probably the new technology is going to be more challenging. And I think for all of us, I don't think that's specific to you. I think we all have to figure out.
We found, I mean, our board members who tend to be on the older side, they all know Zoom now. They've all got it figured out. They're hanging into our Facebook Live events and chatting afterwards in the Zoom reception. And
yeah, I think if my 6-year-old can figure it out, people can figure it out. But I do think that there's a learning curve. But I think it's such a great opportunity because I think there's so many. I think you just have there's like such a great chance to like really expand the audience of who's listening and really teach people about.
Well, it's not dissimilar from the mobile art gallery in the sense that in theater in general, but especially in opera, we do a lot of talk. We give a lot of lip service to accessibility, but there's only so much you can do to get someone, for instance, in that doesn't come regularly to Ward 1 or 2 to come to this building where they don't know if they're going to be welcome. They don't know what the cultural rituals are. They know the space isn't going to represent them. Our biggest challenge is getting people into this building. And once this is away and people can, explore it safely in the safety of their own homes, that's amazing. And that really broadens the amount of people we can reach.
And I think accessibility, like we continue to learn every day with every project about how to expand that accessibility. And I think even more thinking about kind of a more digital approach. In some ways, it opens the door to accessibility, but it also creates more challenges when you realize that there are communities that don't have access to internet and don't use email as frequently. And so thinking about giving them access to digital content, or even, I mean, in our case, we've been exploring like timed entries and doing reservations for gallery visits online. And so like, how do you make that accessible to like a broad audience so that you're not finding yourself back, at that single audience again?
Yeah. And this discussion of access to broadband technology is I think the new social justice thing that's going to happen.
I think so. I mean, I think we've seen that with my daughter's school. And I think that there's probably going to be a lot of good data that comes out of kind of this whole situation when they stop, especially with the schools. I think that'll be a really interesting point because I know like DC public schools And I think in DC, anybody that didn't have internet, if you had kids in school, you could get internet. Like there was like some of the carriers were offering a certain amount of free internet so that kids could access school programming. And I think it'll be really interesting to kind of see how much of that, you know, how many people were able to actually take advantage of that. And I think that'll give us some ideas of like.
So much of the social and cultural learning from this whole thing is going to be that we don't need so much of the in-person experience to do business and to do things, but that is going to create a whole nother tiered structure in socioeconomically. So I think the only solution in the end is to make this a human right, a utility that needs to be public and available.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because I'm finding that people, and I think a lot of what you're doing too, will translate even when we can get back to in person. You know, and it'll be interesting. I even think about this, like these kind of shaken not stirred. I mean, we were talking with the team about like, why couldn't this live on after? Like, why did it take this to?
Like we've shared an office for a year and a half and never
had a drink, and now we're having drinks.
Exactly. And it's just, I mean, actually, this conclusion, which led all the in-series thinking, actually started with my church job, because once we moved all services to a virtual space and started doing all this online stuff and saw the way people could access that content to diffuse to 5 times, 10 times the normal amount of people we were reaching, because we should have been doing this all along, actually.
Right. So what are you, I mean, obviously you have your hands full planning a virtual season, but are you finding time for yourself during all of this?
Almost none. I mean, I don't know if you feel the same. Yeah, I feel I'm working much harder because it's harder to draw the line, and I've run out of things to do after the line is drawn, so I might as well just be working. I mean, I commute every morning. I go to the house, I leave the house, I go around the block to come to work, go back to the house and work. But turning off at the end of the day is hard.
That is hard. I feel like it's interesting because I feel like and I don't know if it's the pressure of like just making sure that everything is where it needs to be so we can continue and survive, and, you know, knowing that things are going to be different for the next few months. But I feel like I could work nonstop.
I cook a lot more, which, you know, some of that is being at home and being able to, but a lot of it is like realizing I don't need to eat out as much as I was. And clearly my husband has a hobby, making paper animals hang on the wall. So I need to find something like that. I feel more connected. I mean, I feel like I talk to family, I talk to patrons, I talk to donors way more than I did before.
I'm hopeful. I think I get a little nervous about what will happen in DC. I feel like we have such a rich cultural kind of landscape here in DC, and I'm really hopeful that that is maintained. I'm sure there will be some fallout from all of this, but
there'll be a lot of casualties, and you're right. The fear is that they all happen in one sector, and that sort of diverse ecology doesn't remain. Well, and I've been saying from the beginning that, I mean, small organizations are better equipped to weather this. Big organizations will survive because they're legacy institutions, but there are a lot of large institutions that haven't been doing necessarily the most innovative work and are going to struggle to survive this. And that's not necessarily the worst thing.
But I think that's why it's so interesting, and I think it's so smart what you guys have done. You've been really thoughtful and strategic about how you're going to lay it out and implement it. And
it also levels the playing field in a beautiful way. I mean, we have as much capability to create appealing content as most of the big players, and it all comes then down to innovation and creativity. Yeah,
but I think to your point then, we're small. I mean, we're small like you guys, so like we're nimble and we can be reactive and responsive in ways that bigger organizations can't.
And we'll see the value of that now, because audiences will want content that has that sort of relevancy to their everyday.
Yeah, good. Well, Tim, this has been fantastic.
Thank you, Christy. It's a pleasure. Even if it did take a pandemic, I'm finally glad we got that drink. I've been doing these in conversation in our pajama recordings with, I don't know, famous music critics. But it's just fun to get them in their pajamas.